Hello, everybody. Welcome to my channel. My name is Margaret Pennard. I'm a historical fiction and fantasy author. Yes, I'm reading to remember my own title. And you're on Booktube. Woo, we're starting a few minutes early because we've got a lot to cover. I thought it was 19. It's actually 20 books since my last wrap up. So this is a Wednesday wrap up, one of my normal features of the channel. I do a little booktube, I do a little author tube, and if you are a subscriber, you know that we've just had a huge, intense August, Agitation August, where I interviewed people most weekdays of the month about a book that transformed them. So I did not do any regular content during August because of that. So I've got all those books to catch up on that I read for sanity. And yeah, just sort of getting back into the groove of things. I will let you know I will be changing my days starting in September. So I think I'm going to move to a Wednesday, Friday schedule. Some Mondays when I need to because of like travel and other stuff. But this is me. This is an Airbnb because secret project. And you'll hear about that in October unless you're a Patreon subscriber or a channel member. And then you've been hearing about it all summer. So it's not too secret to you. Okay, so 20 books. I'm going to start with a few statistics, which I thought were pretty funny, actually. I am going to put the playlist for August in just so we can celebrate that and keep people listening to those great interviews, because I will be referencing some of those interviews for the reads that I did in August. So just so people know where to go for that, it's in the chat. So 19 total books plus a bonus that I almost forgot, so I didn't put it in the thumbnail. The thumbnail is kind of crowded already, so it's doing some heavy lifting, as the kids say. 6 Agitation August books, which 1, 2. I think I only have 2 physical library books from. The others I've returned or they're packed away somewhere. 5 how-to books, which I thought was funny because I did not plan this, but somehow in the month of August, I read How Trust Works, How to Kill a City, How to Do Nothing, a chapter for the read along, How to Save the World for Free, which is an impulse buy in Pels, and How We Learn to Be Brave. So I don't know, something was in the air, something was in the water, and I felt like I needed to learn how to do things. So that was fun. And let's see, 6, 5, and then let's see, 1 picture book for architecture, 3 guilty pleasure backlist reads, some quite old, 1 guilty pleasure recent release in fantasy, 1 guilty pleasure recent release in mystery, and of course, you know when I say guilty pleasure, you know I don't actually feel guilt, it's just that it's a comfort read. 2 nonfiction in politics, 1 nonfiction in climate, which is actually politics, political, 1 self-help book, 1 science book, and 1 biography. So some vast distribution across the genre, which is pretty cool. I like when we diversify book lists. You'll hear about that later. And for format, I've got 5 paperbacks that I owned that I read, that some will be resold, which is great to get them out of the house. 2 Libro.fm audiobooks, 4 hardcover owned books that I can either pass on or keep, 6 library books. You know, we got to use our libraries because we're paying for them and they're great community resources, and 2 borrowed books because your friends are a resource and you are a resource for your friends. So don't forget, just be mindful of their rules about their books, I would say, if you want to keep your friends. So I thought that's pretty cool. We got a lot going on. And yeah, we're going to dive in. I've got 3 sections. I've got the first section, which was okay to pretty good. And then I've got the Agitation August reads to go through, which I'll do pretty quickly because I want to refer you guys to the interviews where we go in depth. And then I've got the chunk of books that were like the really excellent, thought-provoking reads. So we'll go from like least said about the book to most said about the book. And I took some pretty careful notes for some of those. So the end will be worth the wait. So let's see. The first thing on my list is the Jane Austen Society. And so here I'm going to share, because I don't have this anymore. This is one of the paperbacks that I owned. I started it and I put it down, and then I picked it back up at the very end of Jane Austen July and finished it in August. So it is on the August wrap up. Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner. Let me scroll down a little bit so it's centered for you guys. This was a historical fiction that is post World War II. It's talking about people starting the Jane Austen Society, which is in an effort to preserve things as they were in one of the villages that she lived in, and how people come together and how they influence each other's lives. It has a lot of little Easter eggs for Jane Austen books, of course, and it was a very nice read. But when I finished it and I discovered this wasn't anything related to how the society came together, and there is one that exists, I was just a little weirded out that it wasn't an attempt to marry with the actual history. So that made me feel a little meh about it. So not that the writing wasn't good, not that the characters weren't good. I just went, okay, that's a weird thing to do. Not my favorite. So we'll see if I find a different Natalie Jenner book that takes a different approach and can love it a little bit more. Then we have the puzzle box, which is, no, I don't have to scroll. I actually have that in hand. The Puzzle Box by Danielle Trussoni. So this is actually hardcover, and I got it for my sister for her birthday or Christmas last year, and she read it and passed it on to me, so I got a secondhand regifted. But I got this because the book sounded so good in one of the interviews with Hank Philippi Ryan, who I produced for and just did a live with yesterday on A Mighty Blaze. It's a new release. It's a mystery. It takes place mostly in Japan. It's got sort of imperial history elements, but it's basically like a locked puzzle mystery combined with some spy elements and historical secrecy stuff. So it's not my usual kind of read, but it was very good. There were some plot holes, things that I was like kind of wondering about, but it was fast paced. It was fun. It brought a few cultural things that I didn't know about that I was happy to learn. And yeah, fun read. So mystery, if you like mysteries, really pretty cover. So that's that one. Good morning, Greg. First time joining in one of your live wrap-ups. A wrap-up version. Nice to see you. Yeah, this is going to be a bit bigger than normal, so I'm going to try to get through it in a efficient way. Then I've got the Four Tendencies, which is a library read by Gretchen Rubin. Let's see, we're going through the okay to pretty good books. And if you have read any of these, let me know if you agree or disagree that they're just okay to pretty good. But this was recommended to me by Melissa Ike, who is another YouTuber who often does productivity sprints, and it has a lovely chat community because she was doing some life coaching with me because I won it as a giveaway from the AuthorTube Writing Conference, which is awesome backstory there. But it's a very simple book. It's a self-help, and it's different personality types. But instead of like astrology or the Enneagram, which are like everything about you, it's based on how you respond to external expectations and how you respond to internal expectations. And there's 4 combinations, 4 permutations, if you will, of those. And so I think I used that word right. So she talks about which of those 4 archetypes you are and how that can help you to figure out how to motivate yourself to do things and not basically sabotage yourself. So that was really interesting, and I'm trying to incorporate this into some of my task planning and yearly planning, and I'm really glad that Melissa recommended it because it sort of threw a switch in my brain about how to organize things in my life maybe a little better. So if you're looking for something where you're like, why am I constantly feeling the resistance or things like that, this might be a little eye-opening thing to throw the switch and get you to realize. But again, it's a hardcover book and it's pretty short. So it's one of those things where it's a long essay, and I wouldn't like read the whole thing or keep it. So you get the lesson and then you can let it go. So great read from Gretchen Rubin, and happy to have that under my belt. Hello, Jim. Welcome, welcome. Hey. Next on the list, we have How to Save the World for Free. So this is one of my how-to books that I had for some reason this month, this August. How to Save the World for Free. And this is when I retreated to Powell's for a few hours and went through several of my favorite sections, including climate. And this book is by Natalie Fay. She's French but writes in English, I think, and she's a climate activist. And this is basically one of those books that has like lots of tips, sort of things you can do to help the world. And they're organized into types, and some of them overlap a little bit. She does a good job of organizing it. She's based in the UK, but has a lot of consideration for an American audience and translating, oh, you may not have this issue as much, or oh, you may not have this available to you, but you can check this and this. So I liked this just as like a booster shot, if you will, of ways. And I did tab. So I bought this used and I did tab things that were new to me. So I want to look into what possibilities I might be able to find for those ways to save the world. So it was good. Is like, again, not going to be something that I would go back and reread. It's just I want to take those tips, put them into practice, and carry on. Let's see. Polsinney Harbour, I do not have because I think I sold it back already. So we'll come back to my screen share here. Polsinney Harbour by Mary E. Pearce, 1983. So very, very backlist. This was a historical fiction. It's less of a romance. It's more of like if you ever saw A Woman of Substance. It was a mini series with Liam Neeson in it in the early 80s, I think one of his first roles. And did I read the books or do I just have the DVDs? I think I just have the DVDs. But it's very much the same approach. It's a young woman who starts out and wanting to be independent, kind of like, is it a Thomas Hardy where there's like this doomed romance? It's not Tess. What's the other one with the field and the guy who name starts with G? I'm not remembering anything this morning because my brain is a little slow. Anyway, it's a independence of a woman's lifetime and how it changes. So this is a young woman who comes to town because something happened in her old town. So she marches around the English coast and finds a new fishing village, tries to get a job. And she gets along with some locals and she doesn't get along with others, but she finds a niche for herself and sticks in. And you get the little politics of the small town. You get it's like a 19th century Cornish fishing village, I believe. And there's a happy ending, so you could consider it a romance, but the romance is kind of roundabout and it's not really focused on. So it's more about her choices and the attitudes of people around her. And I thought it was pretty good. So far backlist, going to be probably hard to find because it's out of print, but I like finding these. This was a used bookstore in San Luis Obispo, Phoenix Books, that I found this in, and $1 buy. How can you go wrong? So really liked that, but was able to pass it on because, I don't know that I'm going to read it again, but I appreciate the story. A Secret and Unlawful Killing. I do have this one. This is a mystery. So it's the beginning of a series called The Burren Mysteries, I think, by Cora Harrison, and I couldn't find a link to buy it. She's got ones later in the series that are available on bookshop.org, but not this one, which is the first, I think. So that could be a vestige of like her changing publisher, so I'm not sure. A Mystery of Medieval Ireland. So this is pretty cool. It's kind of like a Brother Codfell, but it's from the view of a woman who is a kind of like a magistrate in medieval Ireland. So you get to learn about medieval Ireland laws before they were under colonization. You get to, again, witness an independent woman in history and her choices and the people around her. But you also get a fun murder mystery, which is the Brother Codfell element, which is what I grew up on. So I really liked this. It was fun. I would definitely try more of these. I saw it when I looked at the descriptions that something in here, there's a spoiler for it on the bookshop bookshop.org description. I was like, oh. So just shows that you can't read synopses or even marketing descriptions and be safe sometimes. But anyway, loved the detail, loved the intrigue, loved the pacing and the setup and the historical facts that you get to learn. So would recommend that. Jim, I think you would enjoy these as well. Cora Harrison's series of the Burren Mysteries, because she's on the West Coast in a place that's still known as the Burren because it's got this big stony landscape. So very neat. That's a good one. Then we've got another English author with The Fortnight in September. We're getting to like good, better books here. This is by R.C. Sheriff, and it's a classic. It's from 1933. I was talking a little bit about this with Gareth when he came on during the closing session. The Fortnight in September shows a family, middle-class family, going off to their many often visited every year Bogner holiday. And so you basically just witness some sweet family time, family worries, small dramas, and eventually, a happy sort of conclusion that the life will go on. I always find it a little bittersweet to read these historic novels from the interwar period, because that they think they've just gotten over the biggest catastrophe of their life, the war to end all wars, and they don't know that there's another one coming, which is going to decimate the landscape. So it's interesting. I enjoy reading those, both nonfiction and fiction, because it's such a strange thing to be on the other side of the future and realize what they don't know. Isn't that cool? So I really liked this one. It's low stakes. You would definitely call it cozy. R.C. Sheriff is known for his play. He says in the little excerpt from his autobiography here that he only had success. He only found viral success, if you will, when he gave up and just wrote what he wanted to write, when he stopped trying to do something big and grandiose and just was like, whatever, I'm just going to write about family. I had this crazy idea, or I'm just going to write this play and had this crazy idea. And that's what really took off. So writers take heart. But yeah, really nice, low stakes, cozy comfort read there. And then the last one in this category is back to my screen share. It's going to be the architecture book. So I thought about starting a series for these, because every once in a while I feel like a picture book, like I don't have the bandwidth to read and absorb, or I don't trust myself to find a good recommendation. So I just want to look at things and I read the captions, So Louis Sullivan is an interest of mine. He's an American architect. He's the immediate predecessor in the line of Frank Lloyd Wright. So this is basically documenting with beautiful pictures all the remaining buildings that he designed that were built and still stand, and even parts of them that have been partially remodeled. We get some interiors, we get some close-ups on exterior detail. It's beautiful. So if you like architecture that is floral, that imitates nature, that has lots of like small details, that is not the cut down Art Deco or minimalism of Frank Lloyd Wright. It's what precedes that. So if you see that we have sort of a pendulum in architecture where it's lots of detail to very little, and we've sort of been in the very little jink, jive, whatever the word is, for a long time. The beige, the minimalism, whatever. I'm not that kind of person. So I really like Louis Sullivan. He was a Chicago architect around the turn of the 20th century. So from the 1880s, when he started with another partner, to like the 1910s, when he really like couldn't get money and sort of died in penury, unfortunately. His style went out and this other style came in. So I loved looking at this and just letting my mind rest. It wasn't a challenging thing. It was just, I want an adult picture book. So coffee table books. If anyone thinks that's a fun idea and wants to join me in like a coffee table book series, let me know. Maybe we could like trade off, or not read them jointly, but just use the same hashtags and have people relate the books as a series. That could be fun. Oh, Eva was here early, but the live didn't start. Dang it. I thought being here would make it remind me when you started, but no. I know. Sometimes having like a different tab open negates that somehow. Hi, Hi again. I started a little bit early because we have a lot to get through. Hi, Cat Paw. Hello, hello, and welcome. All right, so this is the first stanchion of books, the okay to pretty good. And now we're going to move to the Agitation August reads that I covered. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on these because there are a whole live stream interviews devoted to them. But let's see, we've got, I need to go back to my screen share and scroll. Steering by Starlight, Find Your Right Life No Matter What by Martha Beck. So I would call this a self-help book, but it's also Agitation August, so I'm including it here. This is my interview with Elaine from Cobalt Dragon, and we had a grand old time. We talked for about 2 hours before I was budgeting my time for the StreamYard limit. But this is basically where we were talking about how you make plans, make goals, and what you believe about how you can achieve them, and how you narrow down to what is really authentically you and stop listening to other people's thoughts about what you should do. So I really liked the way Martha Beck had of addressing this. Her tone is great, her humor is great, and she has good exercises and actually pieces where you can do little, not quizzes, not like a Cosmo quiz, but things where you can list what you would do, and that tells you a little bit about how you would best plan for your achieving your goals. So we love that here. So that was great. Scrolling up, we've got the other book that Venn talked about. So he chose Hell Followed With Us, but also 1984. I read the graphic novel, which is from the library, which I returned because I needed to get the books out of my house. But it was pretty disturbing. I will say I had never read 1984 before, to my knowledge, but I am a George Orwell fan because of some of his other books that I read. This is really a dystopian nightmare that is also a playbook for US society right now. So the last half, when it was like basically psychological torture in graphic novel form, was pretty disturbing for me. But a lot of the messages are talk basically to what Melinda was talking about, disinformation. 1984 is all about the state, the government, a cabal planning on how to destroy people's version of truth so that they control everything. And that's this tiny, tiny percent, 1%, that decides who comes up and what reality is. And then there's a cadre of bureaucrats that perpetuate this, that do the work for them. And then there's a mass floating pyramid of plebes, plebiscite, plebeians, peasants that live desperate lives without any art or hope or anything like that. So pretty dismal. Yeah, so refer to Ven's Corner, and my review of this book for at the end of the interview is about 1984. So that was from last Tuesday. Very good discussion. Hi, Dee Dee. Welcome. We're doing a Whopper wrap up today. I've got 20 books to get through, so getting through my second section here. Kappa's asking, what's your favorite Orwell novel? I'm not sure about novel. I remember reading Down and Out in Paris and London, and that was really good. And then there was another nonfiction that I haven't read yet, Keep the Home Fires Burning, I think. So I think it's more of his nonfiction that I've connected with. Maybe the fiction is a little too on the money in terms of foretelling the future. So it's a little unsettling. So 1984. Then we have, do I have it? Do I have it here? I know. Gotta have it. Do I not have it here? We refuse. Is it in the house? Did I? No, I haven't given it back. Okay. We refuse. I should have had this, but I put it in a safe place in the house because I can't return it to Leo yet. This is one of the borrowed books from Leo. Actually, that's the other borrowed book. So We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance by Kelly Carter Jackson. This was the one I discussed with Marcy Thomas of Brown Girl Collective last Thursday. It was a great interview. She was a lovely guest. We talked about the points of this book, less about the progression of the 5 ways in which Black people have resisted that are outside nonviolent resistance, but more about how we reacted to them and how we connected those examples to other books and things in our lives. But great discussion, great book, 5-star read, and very thankful that I borrowed it from Leo. So definitely encourage people to read it for today's climate in the US and around the world. Yeah, I would agree, Greg. We Refuse has the best cover. This is an actual painting that was taken for the cover. So if you're interested in looking up the painter and their other works, you can probably go to the Kelly Carter Jackson's website or look at the interview where Marcy at Brown Girl Collective talked to Kelly Carter Jackson, because that's how I first heard about this book, is through that interview. So it's a great one. And they talked about the painting and the artist specifically. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I highly recommend. Then Attack from Within. We've got another Agitation August read. I read this at the very last minute. There we go. I started it early and thought I'm not going to have time to get through this, but then cajoled myself into finishing it. And it was pretty good. It's Barbara McQuaid. She's a podcaster, apparently. This is what Melinda told me. And Attack from Within is about how disinformation is sabotaging America. This was last Monday's interview, so not Labor Day, but the Monday before, with Melinda at A Web of Stories. And basically, we don't necessarily talk about it, but it's the engine that's fueling a lot of our polarization. Barb McQuaid is a legal scholar. I think she used to be a federal prosecutor. So she goes into a lot of the legal issues about like why we haven't been able to fight back, or why we're particularly vulnerable, and has a few good solutions at the end of the book where how we can recalibrate or re-emphasize the weapons we have to fight disinformation. It's not just a fact checker's job. We have to be more aware of it and more wary of disinformation campaigns, because that's how we fall into fascism. So very important book, very useful. It's kind of like Dark Money by Jane Meyer, how I read that several years ago. And then my antenna were up for how the ways that money influences politics. This is a great one for how our information infrastructure needs to be strengthened and secured. And so it's just another one of those antennas up. Oh, now I'm aware. I'm going to be more careful about certain things and recognize certain patterns, so I won't as easily fall victim to that scam, basically. So an important book. How to Resist Amazon and Why. This is another on the screen share that I did earlier. I listened to this as a Libro.fm book. It's by Danny Kane, and he is a bookstore owner and now author because of this book. He owns the Raven Bookstore in Kansas. And what he did with this book originally in 2017, I believe, but it's got several different updates because the monopoly continues to evolve and get worse, was he had a structure where he goes through the different violations of norms that Amazon has engaged in, interspersed with like hopeful interludes about how his bookstore is a community resource, about how people are lovely and readers support it, interactions with authors, lovely things that the bookstore in the community brings about. So I liked that structure. This was our talk with Grace. So Books and Cooks, if you want to look up the channel, came on 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday. And we had a lovely discussion about this book. We had so many things to cover because, again, Amazon is a monopoly that has its tentacles in many different industries and violates our societal norms in many different ways. So I would definitely encourage you to watch my interview with Grace. She is very savvy and had a lot of great points. She emailed me pages and pages of notes. I had lots and lots of bookmarks in my audiobook, so we were trying to layer in all of them. Just another note that I'm not going to cover this, but another one of my how books for this month, How to Do Nothing, is a read along that Grace is leading. And I don't remember if I did the chapter for, oh no, I must not have, but I'm not going to cover it. Like, go to Grace's channel to cover the August chapter, which is chapter 5. I went through and made notes and responded in her comments, but I'm not going to go into this now. I'll just skip ahead to the last one for September when I have more time to go into it. So that is that read along that I encourage people to participate in. We're doing one chapter at a time so that we can slow down and really absorb, discuss, sort of digest. And that is part of the message of the book. Resisting the attention economy, I think, is important for all of the issues that we discussed in Agitation August, for being an independent, critical thinker and not being co-opted by big tech, the billionaires, the 1%, etc. So great choice. And then the last Agitation August read of this wrap up is going to be How We Learn to Be Brave, which is 2 Fridays ago, I believe. This is by Marianne Edgar Buddy. It is my interview with Pat from Book Chat with Pat. And this is a book by an Episcopal bishop who is a lesbian woman in the Episcopate, I don't know if that's the right word, DC. And so she came to fame because of the way that in her sermons, homilies, whatever they call them in Episcopal faith, for the inaugurations, she has twice spoken directly to resisting Trump's bad impulses, his violations of societal norms. It's just what I'm going to use. And so she came to some prominence because she did it again this year in 2025. So this is the book that Pat chose. And again, I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to get to this book to read it for our discussion. I'll just do the Cliff's notes, but then I ended up reading it through, and it was really interesting. The reason I wanted to is because she talks about decision moments and how learning to be brave and vulnerable and make those courageous choices is not just a decision, and it's not just an inherent thing. We have to work at it. So she actually breaks it down in her life, different types of decisions, whether it's setting off on something, whether it's staying in something, whether it's stepping up to the plate, whether it's accepting. So she has these categories that she goes into and explains why she thinks it's a different approach for these different categories. And I found that to be very useful. The religion aspect doesn't come in too much. It's more about social justice, which is why she's in with her faith, which is why she's doing these important things, because her social conscience compels her to try again, to make these tough decisions, to stick with it. So I thought that was a great book, a great personal journey, sort of memoir that is also helpful for the rest of us trying to make good decisions. So that was great. And I would refer you to my interview with Book Chat with Pat if you are curious about that one. Okay. I'm going to take a little water break. So this is my call for, do you guys have anything that's happening soon? Because my mouth's getting dry. I got to stay hydrated. All right. So that's the second section. And now I'm going to launch into, I'll check with the chat in a second, but we're going to launch into let me put the banner up. Thought-provoking and excellent reads. So this, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more books, and these are going to take the most time. So we will probably go longer than the hour, but we'll see. The first one I have is How to Kill a City by Peter Moskowitz. I can't remember why I picked this up. It might have been a library impulse borrow. But it's about gentrification, and he has 4 different cases where he takes up the cities. Do I want to do this one first? I actually don't. I need to do this in a different order because this is the sort of foundation. Okay, so let's do this one first. I referred to this book because I was slowly digesting it throughout the month. It's How Trust Works by Peter H. Kim. And this is one of the Powell's impulse buys when I was combing the sections for a little downtime. It's a neurology, social science, sociology researcher from USC, Peter H. Kim, and he wrote a book because he saw that his research talking about how trust works in society, because he's an organizational sociologist. He saw how trust working in society was really going down a dark path in the US. And so he wrote the book to sort of put out some of his findings that he thought might be useful. But he really held back for most of the book because he didn't want bad actors to pick up this book and then use it as a template for, oh, now I can get one over on people, which he outlined some examples where people have tried to do just that. So I think it's a good book. It's a little slow. It's a little clinical. It's very thoughtful. That's another way to look at it. So I found it a little too measured because I'm used to like plowing right through as a Taurus. But I think as a scientist, that's the respectable thing to do, right? So no shade. Not going to criticize based on that. Just recognizing that it's not my usual biased view. This is more scientific and neutral, which is fine. So I picked it up as an impulse buy. It's by someone in California who is a legit research scientist expert. And I have lots of notes on it. And yeah, look at them. Look at them tabs, as Eva says. Okay, so one of the things that I did not intuit, and so it was an interesting finding, is that as Americans, which is his basically like sample size, we initially start, which is redundant, we start with high amounts of trust between people. So we believe that societal norms will keep people in line. That contributes to high starting trust. We may have it as part of our personality, just like some people are more prone to depression, some people are more prone to optimism. Trust is on that spectrum. So you may just have higher initial trust levels. So that's part of it as your personality. And number three, we have like these sort of floating snap judgment criteria based on appearances, based on facial expressions, based on lived experience. There's like 10 that give us instant feedback. And so that can inform our high initial trust. It may not be accurate, but it's our high initial trust. So that's our starting point, which I thought was interesting because a lot of the dialogue today in the news and the media is about like, no one trusts anyone, but like, ceteris paribus, everything else being equal, we do go into an interaction with a high amount of trust. We don't expect people to be bad guys. Interesting. The second finding is that we tend to respond to someone else's trust, like on the receiving end, by wanting to prove it right, to prove that that trust is justified. So instead of thinking like, oh, this person trusts me for no reason, I'm going to take advantage of that, I'm going to be a bad guy. Most people respond in a way that says, oh, they put some trust in me, I'm going to act as if that's justified and like want to prove them right and have a solid relationship. Also kind of intuitive, but kind of surprising because of today's environment. Trust continues based on whether the breaches in trust are perceived to be due to competence or integrity. And this is a big finding. So this may not be something that you have parsed into those categories, but once you see it, it might be really hard to unsee. And so that might help you make decisions in the future. So basically that means that if you think someone screwing up your trust relationship, falling down on a commitment is because of competence, we make excuses and rationalize it as, well, they'll do better next time. They'll learn. It's okay. They didn't know any better, right? But if you think it's due to integrity, you'll judge it more harshly and be like, well, that's something inherent. That's something like sticks to the person. Like, I don't want to trust them anymore. So if you high initial trust, but then the continuance of trust is based on whether you think someone screws up because of competence issues or integrity issues, which I thought was really interesting. I don't know if anyone have heard that before. Let's see, page 87, I have an example of the bad actor. So let's check this out. I have so many tabs, but I do have a page number in my notes. So let's see. He says, have noticed several ham fisted attempts by public figures and organizations to do precisely that, meaning be a bad actor and reframe something so that it looks like, oh, I didn't know, competence, rather than, oh, I did this on purpose, which is integrity. For example, when Fox News was caught having used a photo of sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, and his alleged accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell, gosh, have we been hearing about her? That cropped President Donald Trump out of the image. Fox News responded on July 5th, 2020, by stating that the president's image had been cropped mistakenly and added, "We regret the error." Okay, right? So, yeah, really? Was it an error? Or did you just get caught? So that's the sort of thing that is highly relevant, highly pertinent to today's debate about trust. So I thought that was a good example. What's next? He has a whole chapter on apologies, because we might think that, well, when you trust someone and that trust is broken, an apology may help reforge the bonds of trust, right? But there's a whole range of responses based on, again, the perception of what drives the apology, how the apology is framed, all the elements. So I won't go into all of it, but it was just interesting to see that that may not solve the issue, right? He also talks about the carceral system in several pages, basically the prisons in the US. Let me see if I have a good quote for that. Page 106. Let's see. Public debate on how to treat criminal offenders remains heated to this day, with questions of trust in those who committed the crimes, as well as the justice systems we have in place, lying at the center of these arguments. Should we punish for the sake of retribution or deterrence, which are two separate approaches, or should the goal be rehabilitation of the offender or some form of reparation to the victim, which is, again, two different approaches? And what I thought was interesting is this line: society has shifted from one view to another and back over time because, in practical terms, none of them are entirely adequate. And these goals often come into conflict with one another. So we have different goals that are trying to address the trust issues with the offender and society, but we can't decide like which one to use. And so we vacillate and they're in conflict. So it's this sort of problem that we have, that it's like multitasking. The prison system is trying to answer multiple aims and accomplishing none of them in some instances. So I thought that was interesting for prison reform issues. Let me check in here. Bad actor. Maybe that's not a common phrase in Canada. Hi, Elaine. But like maybe it's economics or political science that I'm used to using this phrase, but like it doesn't mean bad acting in Hollywood. It means like actors in an economy, like a business or a leader of a firm or something like that. So yeah. Hi, Leslie. Hello, hello. All right. So further in the trust book, we have negotiation. So there's a chapter on negotiation, and it's talking about kind of like the continued trust learning. The willingness to negotiate is affected by polarization. So he has 3 different cases, page 154, which I can read out as a quote. Okay, so he has another study. Again, he's a researcher, so he's an expert. The study revealed, consistent with past findings, that unanimous groups, so these are the different settings, right? You can have unanimous, everyone thinks the same thing, as well as members of minority factions within non-unanimous groups. So if you have majority, minority, the minority tended to think about the issue, which is how they decide on something, in more simplistic, unidimensional terms, as we might expect from groups that are polarized. However, members of majority factions who were exposed to dissenting minority opinions exhibited much more sophisticated ways of thinking about the problem, that recognized others' views and even found ways to integrate these competing opinions into a cohesive whole. So if you have unanimous opinions, then obviously you go with that opinion. If you have a majority minority opinion, the minority thinks, well, this is our issue. You're not listening. This is the thing that we want, right? Sort of simplistic and cut down thinking. There's another word for it I can't think of. But in some instances, the willingness to negotiate rested with the majority in a majority minority opinion because they felt secure enough to listen to the minority and think, well, what if we twisted this? What if we combined these? And they were able to sort of shift things in a way that maybe addressed part of the problem. So thinking about negotiation and pointing out that from a study was really interesting. Oh, okay. I skipped one, which is an important one. So, in talking about not negotiation, but the trust piece, we have how authority figures are viewed. Um, so, and here's another place for a bad actor to come in. And Peter H. Kim sort of reserved this for the end of the book, but I'm a small channel. I don't think anyone in power is really watching my videos, so I'm okay with like disseminating this information because I think it's interesting for people making judgments about who can be trusted. So authority figures, we have a human tendency to believe that they are more intentional in their decisions and in control of the outcome. So, for example, if you have someone in a company where they do a corruption thing and the whole company participates in it, you blame the authority figure for being the one who made it go down, and you don't blame the minion, right? The person who is at the bottom who didn't have that authority to make those decisions. And there's a little bit of subtlety in this, which I'm not going to go into for time reasons, but I thought that was an interesting finding. And that may be why a minion gets fired because, well, actually, that's wrong. So, okay, so one of my conclusions was wrong. But keep in mind the authority figure is viewed as more intentional and in control. Combine that with, we consider those authorities to be more emotionally skilled because they've gotten where they are, CEO or whatever, and more strategic, same reason. Therefore, we consider them to be less authentic. And so maybe that plays into that, like more intentional and in control, because we think, well, if you're the head of the company, you made the decision, it's an integrity thing. There couldn't be some other factors. Our immediate snap judgment is that, right? And then we think that they might be less authentic because they're in this position. So there's always sort of like a weird human assumptions that tend to be pretty in the research, actually, in the research at least, human things, social perception things, but that we're not aware of. So it's neat that he's bringing these up to the surface so that we can be aware of them and maybe question them if we see a leader of a company do something and the lower level intern get paid or get blamed for it. So then, okay, so here's where the next quote comes in, page 161. So it was talking about a specific case involving the New York Times. Was it the New York Times? No, involving Wells Fargo. Okay, so yet it is also the case that when the scandal was first reported, blame was placed squarely on those low-level branch workers rather than the unreasonable demands they faced. So this is like the flip side of that coin. The American public erred, as we typically do, by placing blame on those who committed the actions rather than on all the pressures, incentives, and failures by those who should have known better, but still promoted these actions, even if they did not engage in the activities themselves. Meaning, like, we had the plausible deniability at the CEO level. They put these goals. I think it was like you have to have this many new clients, you have to have this many new loans, or you're fired on the low-level branch employees of these Wells Fargo banks. And so that led to the Wells Fargo low-level employees inventing things, opening accounts, credit cards, whatever, that were invented, that were legal because otherwise they would lose their job. So there's that flip side of the coin that we think like we place the blame on the CEOs for being intentional, but then we also think like the low-level employees did the deed, so we place the blame on them and let the CEOs get away with enforcing this terrible rule that like keeps the cycle going. So we're not looking at the big picture. We're not looking at what would be most helpful to society. We have sort of a short field of vision, I guess. So that was interesting to consider. We've got 5 moral intuitions. Again, a human thing, right? We've got these 5 pieces that are moral rules. Page 163. Care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. So we all think these are good things, but we order them differently. We prioritize them differently. We have more than one good thing, and we disagree about how to prioritize them. So that sets up all sorts of issues when we talk about trusting other people's judgment. So he goes into some detail about that. And then what's interesting is that page 182, when these moral rules meet facts is when you sort of like go, oh, you have like a moment of a wake up moment going, oh, maybe there is something that's better than my system of ordering these. So for example, it can force us to take careful stock of these moral intuitions. We might uphold the moral intuition of authority without question, for example, until we confront the hollow ring of Nazi military executioners. We might champion the moral intuition of loyalty until we bear witness to previously unimaginable atrocities that this principle enabled against innocent victims who happen to be different. So loyalty to the in-group. But then you see what it did to the out-group, and then you go, oh, maybe that isn't the best thing to uphold. We might consider the moral intuition of fairness unassailable until we learn how readily many of the perpetrators used self-serving conceptions of fairness to justify their egregious actions. So calling something fair when the playing field is tilted, that sort of thing. So he really goes into those like trade-offs and like reconsidering, oh, well, maybe you have to be more flexible with these moral rules, which I think is a good approach. There's other things that he talks about, but since we're on a limited time here, I will just introduce the Pareto principle and the trade-offs that he talks about. Basically, these moral intuitions are at the heart of people's moral guidance and whether they trust other people's moral compasses, right? So when you have multiple goals, like with the prison system in the US, you have a trade-off where you cannot get more of one without getting less of another. And so you've got to negotiate people to maybe reimburse the ones that are losing or make reparation to the one that has lost. So the Pareto principle is something in economics. And I wonder, to bring in an Agitation August interview, what the Marxist response to that would be. Because for me, it brought up when I talked with Gareth, there was a question about different sectors of the economy, like the farmers and the consumers of a city. They both need different prices for wheat. What do you do as the government? How do you mediate those needs? So same kind of thing. You have a frontier of, well, if you do more of one, you have less good for another. How do you make that right for people in your community? So I doubt Gareth will watch this deep into the video, but if he does, what is the Marxist response? And, if you want to bug Gareth and ask him that question on my behalf, feel free. Let's see. Okay, I think that's about the bad actor comment, but it might be out of context. Okay, so it works in Canada too. Okay. And Elaine says, when I worked with that clientele, no one seemed that interested in meeting them. And I'm not sure who that's about. Emma is here. Hello, hello. Emma just dropped a video about leaving Twitter after writing a book about Twitter. So I have that on my list to watch, but this week is chaos. I have no time for watching videos, so I will be coming back to that, but just to flag it for other people. Okay. Whew. So There was a lot going on in this book. I left out stuff that I made notes on just this morning because of time, but definitely encourage. I don't think it made a big super splash when it came out last year, but there were a few interviews on book on YouTube about it, and I may ask Dr. Camp if he wants to come on the channel because he seemed to have some good stories and like have his heart in the right place. And like, if I want to continue the Agitation August vibes, hey, let's keep it going, right? All right. The next thought-provoking and excellent book would be, dun, 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 come on, a little ribbon here, A River Lost. So this is the one that got me thinking about some of the issues that Greg might know more about. A River Lost is one of the books I borrowed from my friend Allison. It's called The Life and Death of the Columbia River, and it's by Blaine Harden. So it's maybe 10 years old, and it's a nonfiction book by a ace war correspondent who came back from his job, came back to where he grew up in Eastern Washington, and just started looking around at the landscape. So it's an environmental history / memoir of all the crazy cognitive biases that we can observe in Eastern Washington and Idaho and that region. So I will dive into this and tell you a little bit about it. First thing is that I found the tone to be not unsettling, but strange, right? So he's this do-gooder liberal journalist, and he's coming back to his hometown, which is really conservative farming country in the middle of the state, and realizing that these people that he knows and grew up with are operating in this cognitive bias way. So he has this sort of biting irony mixed in with, like admiration, but like wonder and befuddlement. So it's a very interesting tone, very entertaining to read. I read this pretty quickly, very enjoyable, if like sad and, political. So that's the first thing I would note is the tone. Interesting. For example, page 14, I've got the Columbia, the river, represents an American West that for most of the past 2 centuries has summed up progress, patriotism, and virtue in a single word: conquest. When I returned home, I set out to follow the self-righteous rise and disputatious fall of the West's most thoroughly conquered river. In particular, I went searching for myths that users of the river made up about themselves. Myths of Western individualism that had been sustained by a half-century's worth of other people's money. Ooh, that's cutting, right? That's like, ouch, burn. Okay, so let's dive into why that exists and what the various users of the river are, because I thought that was a great thesis for the book. So page 71, I've got flagged here, the trade-off of storing water in the summer. Okay, so one of the trade-offs, let me back up. That was the thesis for the theme of the book, right? But basically it's about the damming of the Columbia River. So the Columbia River was like the most amount of water, the fastest running most amount of water, and it's the site of famous salmon runs with various indigenous groups that depend on those salmon runs throughout the state, going all the way inland to Idaho. So they go up, they spawn, they come back to the ocean. So they've got a very evolved fish biology that depends on the cold water in the river at certain times of the year. And when you dam it up to make electricity cheap for farmers and a nuclear plant and irrigation and etc., the other various users of the river, that means the salmon don't have it at the temperature they need to survive. It gets too warm, it gets too slow, etc. And it took me a second, but basically I had to figure out, okay, if you store the water in the dam, a lot of water in the dam during the summer, because you want to save it up for the winter to release it and make electricity generation for when it's cold and people are heating and energy needs are high, that means that it's not flowing during the summer as it usually is, and that's when the salmon come up to spawn. So that's sort of the biggest trade-off, I think, is the electricity users versus the salmon surviving. And just for scale, I'll skip down to page 218, the scale of the fish loss that people have determined. Out of about 400 species of fish, about 100 of them have become extinct in the past century. About 200, more than 200 of them are endangered. So this is a lot. This is a lot of extinctions happening. This is a lot of endangerment of whole species of fish. Okay, happy thought. Page 113 is my next note. This is the federal government worming its way out of paying the Colville Indians. So it was just a note about how much the federal government makes off the electricity generation. The Grand Coulee Dam. So it's the biggest, but it's just one of the whole dam system. There's probably like a dozen. The Grand Coulee earns the federal government more than $400 million a year. Since the dam went online in 1942, it has earned the government more than $5 billion. And although half of the dam, just one of the dams, sits on reservation property, none of the power earnings was allotted to the Colvilles. Colville Indian Reservation is the reservation he's referring to. So there's another user of the river that got shafted in this arrangement, and they have endured a lot of poverty and environmental degradation and mental health bad effects from this. So we'll just leave that and not go into it in too much detail. Page 119 gives an idea of the scale of the water used. So this gets out the privilege of the local, water used. Nope, this is about the loans. Okay, so when you think of, on my channel, you may have heard about redlining before, where you're talking about loan terms. You may have heard about the mortgage crisis. You may have heard about predatory loans, where like the interest gets jacked up, etc. There's lots of page space in this book dedicated to how easy the federal government has been on loan terms for these farmers getting water from the dams to irrigate, right? So page 132 is an example of this. Let's see. Wait, 132, 113, 119, 129. Oh, okay. I did this on multiple things to conserve space in my journal. Sorry. 119 is the scale of the water used. So 4,000 landowners in the Columbia Basin Project for irrigation use more water than California's State Water Project, which serves 21 million people. 4,000 landowners, 21 million people. So that's the scale of like how much water is being used. And then the loan terms was a separate point on page 129. The Bureau of Reclamation is the federal bureau that does all the dam building projects, like the Army Corps of Engineers. And it says this the Columbia Basin Project operated according to sweetheart regulations written by a Congress that was loath to offend farmers and consistently willing to forgive and forget whatever debts they said they could not pay. They had 50 interest-free years to pay back just 18% of the cost of the project to irrigate. So I won't do all the quotes, but basically they had interest-free years that got extended and extended and extended, and then like just subsidized. So it's interesting. You have a population who depends on a federal project and has loans that are subsidized. And yet, as you'll see by later comments, they operate in a non-trust of the government way. These are the people who are making comments about not trusting the government, about there being a deep state, about not being dependent on the government. So the cognitive bias there is just alarming. Okay, and then back to 132. 132 is actually a quote about big farmers worming their way around limits to irrigation. So the irrigation project, this big expensive project with very forgiving loans and terms, is set up to create lots of small farms for small farmers, veterans after World War II especially, and it's trying to keep that as its goal by limiting the number of acres you can lease and irrigate, right? So they want lots of small farms, creating opportunities for lots of small families, or big families as it were. But within those limits, you have the father owns one or leases one, the wife leases another. They have cousins that put their name down for leasing another. They have friends that lease other terms. And so they actually control a vast swath of territory. So they're in effect a big farm, but the federal government is not enforcing these terms except way later. So that's a little bit of unfairness and skewing of the goals of the project. There was one federal economic analysis by Whittlesey. I don't remember when it was, between the 40s and the 80s, but he came to town, did an economic analysis of where the water would be best. And turns out when you have a neutral analysis, it doesn't decide on the side of the farmers. And so, yeah, he said it would actually be more economically viable or efficient, I don't remember what the wording was, to keep the water in the dams for salmon and for electricity than it would be to let it to farmers to irrigate. And farmers also put in turbines on the irrigation canals, so they sell electricity from the water they're getting at cut rates from the government, so they're making money off of it other than watering their crops. There's this whole thing, right? The whole interesting complex cycle. And he was this poor federal engineer was vilified, and people, were threatening him and stuff because he wasn't deciding on the community vibe, but deciding on the economic equation. So, hero of his time. Page 142, we've got a great quote about farmers and welfare. So there's someone who Bean was comparing the Columbia Basin situation to welfare cheating in New York City. I used to work for the New York City Welfare Department on the Lower East Side investigating welfare fraud. Mrs. Rodriguez would say she had 6 kids when she only had 4 kids. Why does that happen? She gets more money if she says she has 6 kids. I don't think there is much difference between Mrs. Rodriguez and farmers in the Columbia Basin Project. In this country, everyone takes what he can get. So it was interesting. That was an interview from someone that is part of a nonprofit that's kind of like the Aspen Institute. And so that was an interesting opinion to show maybe the mindset. And then a whole nother user is the nuclear power plant, right? So Hanford, you may have heard of Hanford because of its environmental cleanup efforts. It was originally made for concocting plutonium, finding ways to make bombs for World War II, and now it's been a nuclear energy plant, and now it's been commissioned and tried to be cleaned up, but not really. So the radionuclides from all that action are now in the groundwater aquifer, which empties to the Columbia River, and they have a half-life, the higher ones, of 250 million years, just to show that that's not a good thing. The Hanford engineers, which you think might be middle class, so their views might be different from people who are working class on the river, such as the barge operators, which are another user class. They are also very dependent on the river being dammed and regulated and let out, not for the salmon, but for the electricity and for the nuclear plant. So they have ended up being as dependent-minded on that continuing, this human intervention in the 20th century continuing, as the barge operators. And even though they have vastly different cultures and values, again, going to Gareth's grappling with what does lower class, what does middle class mean anymore in England? We have a similar thing. You might think engineers are white collar workers, barge operators and barge hands are blue collar workers because of the style of work and their attitudes towards certain things in society. But when it comes to, do we support this federal policy of regulating the river? so tightly? Yes, because our livelihood depends on it and we don't want that to change, even though it's only in the last 50 years that it existed. So interesting to note. The lack of awareness among both of those classes of people of the river as the keystone in the whole region ecology is breathtaking. And then we've got the stark contrast of the West and East divide. Okay, so this is an interesting quote, and it pertains back to me because a lot of the Eastern state folks will blame the changing atmosphere and political views. It's not so farmer centered, it's more environment centered, or at least environment considering nowadays. They'll blame the West Coast lefties and like they want a pristine wilderness to frolic in. Well, we need irrigation for our farms. So here's the interesting quote. On the east side, in small towns like Moses Lake or Grand Coulee or Colville, you cannot sit in a coffee shop for more than half an hour without hearing someone in a John Deere cap complain about West Siders with too much money and too little sense telling working people how to live. So there's a political battle. In Seattle or Portland, you can sit in an espresso bar for weeks on end without hearing a single reference to the East Side, excepting the odd complaint about poison leaking out of Hanford. So here we have the juxtaposition of the West Side liberal sort of middle class and upper class versus the self-perceived Eastern side, which is working class, depending on federal dollars, but resenting federal intrusion. So it's just this interesting thing that like, I love that someone's written a book about it, right? This is what I love to dig into. And I also want to hear proposed solutions, which he doesn't go into really. But that's a policy debate. Like if we can trust each other enough to have a policy debate, we can have a non-unanimous coalition of people where we try to listen to each other's views and get creative about solutions rather than being simplistic and saying, well, this is the only thing that'll work. I need my livelihood to continue. This is the only way of life that's worth living. We could actually get somewhere. Just a thought. Just a thought. And there's one final dig on page 238 that I'll share. Okay, this DeHart. So this is a person who has been in charge of, I think, documenting the fish loss and trying to enforce laws that are on the books, and as part of that West Side pushback, right? DeHart said the bargers and irrigators and producers of electricity had again won. The status quo of the 20th century was safe, she said, and many species of Snake River salmon were condemned to extinction. This is after losing one of the battles. She says, quote, to my death, I will be amazed at the tremendous lack of courage of our political leaders. Putting up with short-term grief in order to save endangered species is simply more than they can stand. If you can't control your behavior in such a way as to prevent these lower animals from going extinct, how in the world can you control events to prevent your own extinction? So I thought this is a great book. This is more my usual fare of being biased, right? And having a viewpoint. And this is more the scientific fare. So this is why I'm sort of doing the order in this way. Okay, now I can get to How to Kill a City. And then I've got the Octavia Butler biography to finish. So these are the thought-provoking and excellent books to finish the wrap-up strong. So again, I think this is a library impulse pickup. It's How to Kill a City, Gentrification, Inequality, and the Fight for the Neighborhood by Peter Moskowitz, who also goes by like P.E. Moskowitz. So I put up a link to buy some of these books from Bookshop, and he has both monikers. So I had to look a little bit to find his book. So he is a journalist, I believe, and he ventures into this comparison of 4 different cities and their gentrification journeys and what spurred them. And then thinking about the policymakers, and that quote about lawmakers from DeHart in the last book might come in handy for this one. So let's start out with his thesis, which I can find on page 9. All right, so in all 4 of the cases, specific policies were put in place that allowed the cities to become more favorable to the accumulation of capital and less favorable to the poor. So this, in in a nutshell, is what gentrification is that initially the city as an organism will have a setup where it has some mechanism to provide for the poor so that you have different segments of society. They're not equal access, they're not perfect by any means, but there's a cycle in place. There's a redistribution mechanism, there are programs, etc. And what gentrification does is it comes in and changes the equation so that it is more favorable for capital to come in. And the money that is capital gets rerouted from those provisions for the poor programs to attracting more capital. I'm going to need a water break in a second. So then you have money allocated by the city to attract capital to make up the neighborhoods more attractive to more people. And then you have those upper class people who can afford those higher prices, spurring businesses, etc. So this is his boiled down thesis, and I thought that was a really interesting reframe. Oh my gosh. So Greg says, I knew Norm Whittlesey, the agricultural economist cited in A River Lost. That is so cool. So this book that I borrowed is probably like a decade old, and he was, I think, quoting from a few years before. So when you say I knew, I'm guessing that he's passed on. But what an interesting person, right? Standing up to that. Elaine says, when you create a dam, many ripple effects. That's a funny pun. Loss of land, now flooded, natural flow of water disrupted. Yeah. And the users of the river sometimes know and sometimes don't know that, which is interesting. Okay, Greg's going to speak for Gareth and say the Marxist response might be to just overthrow capitalism. But we'll ask Gareth. Yeah. Sounds fun. And Greg says, one of Idaho's representatives to the U.S. Congress in the 90s claimed that salmon can't be endangered because people buy canned salmon in the grocery store every day. Wow. Wow. Breathtaking. Oh, Idaho, you're you're not looking good. You're telling on yourself. Oh my gosh. Okay, so switching over to the gentrification piece, although it is a really good book. So gentrification, that's the thesis. And then we go to page 34. We're talking about, okay, so a further description of what this looks like. Cities are looking for the rich and the upper middle class to use their tax dollars and spending power to fund what used to be paid for by America's semi-robust federal welfare state. Because cities used to have parks, transit, programs for the poor, and those were federally funded. So that safety net has gone away. And it's interesting because I'm going to call back to my discussion with Melinda at this point. The federal funds to cities is part of the hollowing out of cities. So when I was talking with Melinda, I talked about the media and the education institutions being hollowed out from inside, right? Education has been taken over by the state. It's been defunded. Media have been hollowed out by people who buy them, making them dependent on advertising, dependent on clicks and the new economy, like all these sorts of incentives are being introduced. So I call that like a hollowing out of the inside. What we consider the media as an institution, what we consider the educational system as an institution, and cities, if you want to consider cities like an institution, as like a way that people congregate and come together and make things happen. It's been defunded, right? Lots of things changing in that respect. This is what creates the incentives for the cities to go hat in hand to the upper class and try to get them to come in and invest. So when the federal government yanks the funding, cities have to go elsewhere to get the money to fund those programs. And that's why we get these new incentives. So into the examples. The first one is New Orleans. And of course, the gentrification opportunity, if you will, was created by Hurricane Katrina, destroying a lot of things. So you had to build them up. Well, if you're building them up from scratch, then you can go about it differently. Okay, I'm going to take another water break. Hold on. Oh my goodness. There's just not enough time to go through all these. I love it though. These are such good books. I want to do them justice. Okay, so right after Katrina, weeks later, the state of Louisiana took over the schools, and that gave them an opportunity to destroy one of the bastions of Black middle class in New Orleans, which is the teachers union. So when they took over the schools because they were failing, that meant that they could change the requirements. They had to reapply for the teachers union, and they no longer had the power that they did before to negotiate, to, have a secure feeling state. So that was the end for New Orleans. And here's a generalizable point. Ignorance of the lives of others is what allows gentrification to happen. So when I say that the city turns to people from afar with money to come in and invest so that they can pay back their loans, have those programs for the poor, you have those people come in as gentrifiers and they think, oh, well, we're getting a great deal. We're helping the city. And they're ignorant of the lives of the people who are already there struggling to maintain what they have, right? So I thought that was a really great quote and understanding. If we had more knowledge of other people's lives, and I don't mean through social media, I don't mean through an Instagram filter, I mean working alongside them, having authentic discussions and being open, we could understand more of the problem and address it rather than paper over it and keep that capital machine going. Just my thoughts, just my opinion. In this book, page 77, we're introduced to the rent gap theory, and they use that in the context of Detroit. So the rent gap theory is basically thinking that, well, you make your best investment when you buy at the lowest and sell at the highest, right? So when cities are going through their worst, like New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, or Detroit when the mortgage crisis had done its worst and everything was disinvested in, that is when the capital will flow in because it can make such a killing. And this economic theory is really working on the worst of human impulses and human greed, because when we think about that, it's like the capital can make the most money. Well, yeah, but you're not taking human lives into account. So that's the terrible thing there. And here's a quote from the Detroit case on page 82 here. So one of the other authors who talks about gentrification is, I think, Richard Florida. And he wrote a book about this that admits this problem. One problematic consequence of the rise of the creative class, which is something he trumpets, but is also sort of problematic, is the accelerated sorting of people and cities into an economic hierarchy. And you'll hear about hierarchy later when I get to my final book, the biography of Octavia E. Butler. Our society is not just becoming more unequal, its inequities are being etched into our economic geography. So racial segregation and the schism between the city and the suburb. So threatening to national unity. And I thought that was a great quote to illustrate why gentrification is not the solution. It's just a pendulum swinging back to segregation in a different respect. So that was really great. Revitalization is not gentrification. Yep. Oh, yeah. Okay, so I have a quote that goes back to a thing that we talked about with Pat. Okay, so here's the quote about the Detroit example. Is it a quote? No, it's the author. So it's Peter Moskowitz talking. Sure, it's great that Detroit is to some extent being revitalized, but Detroit has been in need of revitalization for decades. Its population has been shrinking since the 1950s. Black people in the city have been working that entire time to try to keep Detroit from falling apart. Why, some have asked, is it that the country seems to pay attention only when the white people show up? So this made me think of Marianne Edgar Buddy talking about showing up to a protest in front of the White House and having people protesting there before, but the crews of press and the media only came when she was there because she was a famous person, and how she had the heart space to listen to one of the protesters getting mad at her because why are they only listening when you show up, he said. And she thought, that's valid. I need to listen to that. She sat down on the curb with him and listened to him. And it's not happening with gentrification in places like Detroit because the creative class rise and the new opportunities in Detroit is happening because of the gentrifiers' ignorance of the lives of others. And national media is focusing on it as a success not realizing that Black people have been there for decades trying to do the work to accomplish that goal at a with a better result, so with a more equitable result. So that was great. Let's see. They have the same trickle down promises for redevelopment, which is really just a money grab, I think, in this case, because it's contrasted with built-in stabilizing contributions. So instead of having federal funding, again, you're saying, well, we'll get redevelopment companies on the job, which is outside money, which is going to the upper class, which is not keeping people in houses, which is encouraging flight, which is encouraging more poverty, which is putting seniors far away from services and community. It's just tearing apart communities. So not good. All right, then we move to San Francisco. Anyone who's been in San Francisco? Oh, okay. So 133, we've got the author asking a question. And he says, there we go. With rents so high, housing has become precarious not only for low-wage workers, but also for police officers, lawyers, and those other middle-class professions that once bought you a relatively stable life. What happens to a city when artists, teachers, lawyers, and anyone else making less than $100,000 a year cannot afford to live in it? And so I thought that this is really valid. We always talk about housing being unaffordable, rents being sky high, and you sort of wonder about the causes. Like, can we trust, is it outside investors? What is the cause, right? Is it not enough housing stock? Is it implementation? And so this book is a really good grappling with, like, what are the incentives? What are we choosing to do? What are the policies and what are the results? And do we want to make that same choice in other cities? And he argues, no, obviously, we need to go about it differently. So San Francisco, yeah, your barista can't afford to live there. And I would say the norms and the trust in the system is violated because ignorance of others' lives. So yeah, I'm connecting this with the trust book as well. Because if you're ignorant of others' lives and how they live, the example that he gave was people from one of the new tech companies that have moved in and can afford the high rents versus kids in the neighborhood, like the Mission, I think, is in this example. And there's a lot where you can play basketball, and the kids go there every weekday on the set time and a set date or whatever, and they're there playing. And a bunch of these tech bros come on and say, we reserve the court because there's an online reservation system through the city or something like that. And so they kick the kids off, and they're like, they're just completely apathetic about the rights of these kids and the community and what happened before. They think, well, we did the thing that we think makes it right. And so we're not going to listen to any other possible right solutions. So when I was talking about the trust book, I said there's more than one right? You can have moral intuitions. There's 5 different moral intuitions, and we can order and prioritize them differently. And they may think they have the right to the court, and these kids just are getting kicked off. So this is like an encapsulation of the whole system because we don't care about our neighbors. I thought that was a good example that they highlighted. Let's see. Cities, they're no longer places to live. They're ways to grow capital, which is sad but true. I had another another asterisk for Gareth here on page 150, which is about here. What's it about? Suburb shift. Oh, okay. So basically, because people working those barista jobs, working as teachers in inner city school jobs, can't afford to live in the city that's being redeveloped, they have to live an hour away in a suburb or exurb. That suburb or exurb was constructed for middle-class folks, for upper-class folks sometimes. So the quote is, what does it mean that low-income people are now inhabiting these spaces built for the middle and upper classes. And he goes on to say, well, suburbs weren't really built for people in general. They're built for cars, right? Valid point. But it's interesting that we have this shift that now people with less resources are moving to the suburbs because they can't afford to live in the city, but they still need the services in the city that they provide. So there's these nightmare commutes, there's these, in unstable living situations, etc. So it's really problematic. And I think the people living in the cities maybe aren't aware of it. And saying that, I should probably make that one of my things to check, because I know people live on the periphery in Portland while I live in the city, in walkable distance. So that's one of those like uneasy things. Like, I am participating in gentrification, like way at the end of the curve. How can I help um, draw the injustice down, right? How do I help repair the breach that has made in the community? Good food for thought. Let's see. Suburb shift. Oh, and the reason I thought that would relate to Gareth is that, like, maybe you're living in a suburb in a big house, but you're poor because you have to pay to drive. You have your time sucked into the commute. You are barely making that rent as it is because of the inflation, all these things. So, like, where are you in the class level? Because he was talking about how do you define what class you're in England. Pretty interesting. Um, Suburbs were subsidized. Yes, yes, yes. Tax assessment is a choice. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, housing, rents. Is it a shell game? That was my note. 177 Schulman. One of the Agitation August books mentioned Schulman as well, and I can't remember the first name, but it's a person who's written about gentrification. And here's the quote. From Schulman. There's something inherently stupid about gentrified thinking, Schulman writes. It's a dumbing down and smoothing over of what people are actually like. Gentrified thinking is like the bourgeois version of Christian fundamentalism, a huge unconscious conspiracy of homogenous patterns with no awareness about its own freakishness, right? Kind of like the River Lost thing, where you think the status quo is how it's always been and your livelihood is guaranteed, but it's freakishness, right? The gentrification mentality is rooted in the belief that obedience to consumer identity over recognition of lived experience is actually normal, neutral, and value free. So there we go. That's where we have to be better about considering how our actions affect others. Just to keep it simple there. Cities are not the land of opportunity that they used to be. So, oh, we're talking about New York City now. So that's moving back to the New York City example, the final one. And someone made some quote about cities used to be where peasants came into the land of opportunity and to get economic value. But if there's no manufacturing jobs, no factory jobs, no land of opportunity, why don't keep them as peasants? Stay in the countryside. And this is in the 70s, so obviously now that wouldn't fly. But even then, it got some flack as a New York City headline. So I thought that was interesting. They talk about the housing authority and the funding and the growth. And it connects back to the Jenny Odell book, How to Do Nothing. There's a quote at the end where someone at the housing authority or a policy wonk in New York City is talking about how growth is inevitable and good. How do we, catch the people who fall through the cracks? And Peter Moskowitz is, I think, implying, he doesn't outright question, but he's implying what Jenny Odell explicitly questions, which is it's not inevitable and it's not good. Like, why are we allowing our tension to be co-opted? Why don't we fight about this more? So really, really good. Okay, I'm over my budget for the time here, but last book. We're on the last book, which is Octavia E. Butler's Positive Obsession. So let me scroll up so you can see that. I listened to this as an audiobook from Libro.fm, who we love, the sweetest smelling audiobook purveyor in the world. And so I had just a few notes on this one. Positive Obsession. It's a biography by Susanna M. Morris, and I listened to a version narrated by Karen Murray, and I had some concerns about some of the pronunciations, but leaving that aside, the format concerns aside, I thought it was a really good look at the author. I had only read Parable of the Sower for Agitation August, so I'm a new reader for Octavia A. Butler. And so to read her biography next let me into a lot of, I think for me, relatable aspects of her writer life. And so that's what struck me, how relatable her writing life was. She's got frustration, she's got loneliness, she's got confidence, she's got self-doubt. She has a hilarious piece where so a lot of her journals are what were drawn from for this biography, and she defines writer's block as knowing what to say but not how to say it, or when you say nothing because you don't know what to say, or when you don't know what to say so you produce a type of word vomit. And I was like, she nailed it. She nailed it. So I love these little pieces that I got to see into her life and experiences and discoveries. It was really good. So let's see. It talks about how she worked lots of temporary jobs, so temp jobs in factories. She's a working class Black woman in Southern California in the 60s and 70s. And so until she had several books published, I think it was her third book sold, that she finally went to full-time writing. She had short stories and 3 books, and she was still working temp jobs to make ends meet. And so that I thought was interesting because I don't think that's something that you can do in Southern California anymore. There's no manufacturing that I'm aware of on a grand scale. And so the surface jobs that you would have to make a rent and sort of be skilled labor, but not stable money, they seem to me to require more attention than a manufacturing job would. So you wouldn't be able to let your mind wander, and more flexibility, meaning you have to come in now or you're fired, or you have to give, 100% of your attention to the customer and there's no reading on breaks, things like that. So I think that's maybe the co-opting of attention for the service economy, but that's another issue. But just a thought I had when I was listening to her life story. On track 9, I thought it was really cool. She had been writing to resolve feelings of shame about her mother being a maid. So her mother was, I think, born in Louisiana and then came out to California during the Great Migration with her mother and her Octavia's grandmother. Her name was Octavia Margaret, her mother, and she worked as a maid in Southern California in the 50s and 60s as Octavia was growing up. And part of the inspiration for Kindred was this comment from a friend who was mad at the ancestors for not fighting back during slavery, which is kind of like an unawareness that hopefully we don't have now. But I think it's valid to realize that a lot of Black folks might have unresolved feelings about, well, why didn't they do better so that our situation could be better? And Octavia Butler had this incident where she details a really shameful episode where she talked back to her mother and, reproached her for working as she did and taking the insults and abuse that she did to make their life possible. And she thought about it immediately. It was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. But later in life, she was trying to rationalize, like, why were things the way they were? How can I show people now, or earlier self, like when she was a little girl, how can I explain to people now what it was like back then, and that surviving was the best result, like fighting back in tiny ways. And that's what produced Kindred. I thought that was really cool. I just realized I'm not plugged in. I don't want to blink out. There we go. Okay, so that was great. On track 11, she says that Octavia was a student of history and a master at decoding patterns. And so that's why some of her books from the 80s, from the 90s, are really prescient about what society has developed into. And she talks about her Pattern Master series, which has to do with aliens, but it's all about the human society that she sees in her present and what that would lead to. So it's fascinating. Track 11 also, why would a society that is so strong and prosperous descend so swiftly into lawless chaos? So people are asking that about Parable of the Sower. And meanwhile, we're here reading Parable of the Sower in 2025 going, how did she know we would be in such lawless chaos? from the pandemic and other things, you know, guard troops in the cities and just havoc on our borders from ICE and detainment and just the farms, schools being swept, just like ridiculous things. How is this happening in our reality, right? And it's this thing that Octavia had already mapped out, and what she calls the human contradiction, that we have intelligence and create these situations and glories and discoveries, but it also craves hierarchy, which creates inequalities. So you have these two things rubbing against each other, and that is at the source of many of the things that she wrote about in science fiction. So it's pretty neat. Also, track 11, she talks about the community being an antidote to alienation. So if you have people who are disaffected or alienated, I don't hear people using the word disaffected. Maybe that's not a good term anymore. But alienated, you need a community that listens, right? That is the antidote. But what people have misinterpreted in her books are that these people who are alienated are rugged individuals. And so I just think that's hilarious. I mean, sad, but hilarious, because we like to see rugged individuals win, right? That's our American myth. That's our Western story. But what she was writing about was that you need to knit community bonds as an antidote to that alienation, not celebrate it. So, genius. So that was part of the genius of Octavia E. Butler. So I already talked about the writer's block definitions, which are hilarious. And then track 13, I had her prescient foretelling. So she actually touched on climate change. She traveled a little bit later to do research for her science fiction novels. And she also observed from the news. She was a total news junkie. So she was aware of like the 90s environmental destruction. And so for me, this shows that she was seeing that cycle. She outlines it explicitly, saying the climate system was destroyed. This is the cycle. It's followed by pacifying language from politicians. We'll do something. We'll do something. And that is accompanied by denial from the profiteering firms involved in that degradation. And then that is followed by the cycle repeating, right? So destruction, pacification, denial, repeat. And I thought, wow, she could see right through all of these things. It's perhaps because she wasn't yet in a 24-hour news cycle, because I think we're getting the whip of that cycle so fast that we can't even stop to take our breath and digest, which is why we got to avoid the being sucked in and having our attention co-opted. So do nothing. But yeah, imagine seeing that in like the late 1980s. And yeah, we just have Cassandras that are speaking and we're not listening. Let me catch up here. We had a Swank hello coming in to say happy Welsh Rabbit Day, happy Skyscraper Day, happy US Bowling League Day. Oh, speak of the devil, speak of the community. Yes, make sure to hydrate and boop the like button. Thank you, Swank. Appreciate you dropping in. Elaine says lots of examples. Income tax was introduced to pay for the war, still here in 2025. Air travel forever changed after 9/11. And I'm not sure what those are examples of because it was 18 minutes ago. Sorry, I didn't look up that long. Elaine says, what do your teachers get paid here in Ontario? I think start around 40K, but many I know after a few years get 80K and some over 100K a year. Depends on the level of teaching, depends on whether they're doing admin tasks. For some reason, that is more prized and more rewarded. But yeah, in that quote, actually, I would pick a bone with lawyers and police because I don't think that's middle class. I think those are often like way higher salaries, just from personal observations. And then Cat Paw says, interesting. I'm going to look for that Octavia Butler biography. Yeah, really good. Really good. A few last points on positive obsession, which is her own term there. Track 13 had the phrase, my pen and my paper, they comfort me, which I thought was a brilliant co-optation of Psalm 23, because it echoed something religious. And I was like, I think it's my rod and something comfort me, but it's not. It's your rod and your staff talking to God. They comfort me. It's from the shepherd in the valley of death, that Psalm 23. So I liked that. She wrote that in her journal as a reflection of her religious upbringing, but turned on its head for her own situation. Yes. Independent woman. Track 15, we had a note about the ethno-Gothic imagination. So if you are a horror reader, and Leslie, I'm talking to you especially, there's this term that I think someone else coined and is quoted in this book called the ethno-Gothic imagination that particularly applies to Black diasporan communities, meaning African Americans and Black communities elsewhere in the world, where they engage with horror and they use pieces of their history that are horrible to resolve those feelings, grapple with, engage with how do we process this? How do we rise above this treatment of us in the past? And I thought that was a brilliant way of thinking about it. So I might look up that later, but that phrase ethno-Gothic imagination sounded so cool. So I thought I'd flag that for y'all. Oh, and the final note is a funny thing about the copyright at the end. When I say this was recorded and produced and blah, 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 there was an expressly prohibited note to use this publication to train artificial intelligence. And I was like, yes, see, that's why everyone around Octavia Butler is a genius. Don't use our books to train AI. So with that rallying cry, I will take the banner down and just try to conclude and wrap up here. I am 2 hours away. I still have 2 more folks' compilations to go through and take highlights from, but I will get the part 2 for Agitation August highlights up on Friday. So I will be off. My sister is coming to town on Friday, and we will be either doing the secret project or having fun if it's done. So either way, I will be unavailable for Booktube, but Thursday night I will be, putting this up and scheduling it for Friday. So for your delectation. So that is the update on that. This is a super long wrap up because I had 20 books. I had to hold it in all of August. So thank yous for hanging in there with me. Yeah. Thanks for being on my channel and listening to my bookish opinions. I'd love if you would diversify your reading shelf. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you had a difference of opinion on my, okay to good books, or if you've read any of my excellent thought-provoking books, or if this wrap up makes you go back and watch some of the interviews that you hadn't seen before. So yeah, that would be the goal. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your guys' input and comments. And yeah, I will have a great time with my sister. Thanks, Elaine. And thank you all. Take care of yourselves, hydrate, and happy reading.